As a content creator that works in the political space, particularly in American elections, I have to deal with the myths, rumors, and misinformation popping up in the comment section. Many of these political myths have been in political discourse for decades, and if I were to look, I could probably find some from the early days of the Republic. Now, I don't blame people for believing these myths, as the echo chambers in today's discourse have become more soundproof to outside information. And hey, all of us make mistakes. I said incorrectly in a video about Gerald Ford that if he had won the presidency in 1976, he could have possibly won again in 1980. And people in the comment section blasted me for that, and rightfully so. It was a sloppy mistake. But to me, political myths are different from mistakes. The political myths I want to talk about are more focused on changing the political narrative to question the legitimacy of a political outcome. And yes, regardless of the evidence presented or not presented in this video, people will believe the myth regardless. But then there are some people who, I hope, take this information and learn from it. Recently, Chris from Vlogging Through History reacted to my video, and I want to thank Chris for doing that. But in his video, he did say,
But Bush still would have won that 92 election if you didn't have Ross Perot. Ross Perot ran, and it's a fascinating race. And I think pulled, he gets something close to 20% of the vote. And Bill Clinton wins with what, like 40, 42%, something like that. So it was definitely a very unique election in that way. I don't know that that would have been fatal to Bush otherwise.
but it wasn't just that. I heard Chris mention this political myth as well.
In Illinois, he beat him by just 8,858 votes.
In Illinois, he didn't beat him. There were a lot of dead people that voted. And I'm not blaming Kennedy for that. I'm blaming people on Kennedy's behalf.
And this video is to try to reach to those people, the people who I think when presented with the correct information will consider this information when formulating their view of the situation. But before we delve into the myths, many of you who watch my videos are not subscribed to the channel. If you would like to help this channel, which will allow me to focus more time on content creation, please subscribe to the channel and hit the little bell for notifications. If you would like to help the channel out more, you can become a member on Patreon. I want to thank all of my Patreon members for their support. And now on to the video. The myth that most people in the comments section like to bring up is that Ross Perot's entry into the 1992 presidential election resulted in Clinton winning. Luckily for us, this is probably the myth that we can easily bust the most. First, let me present the evidence in my original video about the matter. A study done by splitticket.org released in April of 2023 looked at exit polling data from the voter research study to determine if Ross Perot's entry into the race hurt Bush. According to their examination on the VRS data, those who voted for Perot preferred Clinton 51% over Bush with 42%. In other academic publications, which I will provide down below in the description, Alvarez and Nagler in the American Journal of Political Science, Volume 39, Issue 3, use probit modeling to estimate vote choice without Perot. Here were their conclusions. Quote, the multi-nominal probit technique gives us an expected utility to each voter for each of the three candidates, as well as an estimate of the relationship between the disturbance terms for the three candidates. Thus, for each Perot voter, we can compare his or her expected utility for Bush to his or her expected utility for Clinton and utilize our estimate of the distribution of the disturbance terms to predict for whom they would have voted for. 49.5% of Perot voters would have voted for Bush, 50.5% would have voted for Clinton. Thus, the Perot voters would have been split evenly between the two candidates. This means that Perot voters were not voters who would have deserted Bush with or without Perot's presence. End quote. They further predict that with Perot out of the race, Clinton would have won 55% of the popular vote. Another study by Lacey and Burden in the 1999 American Journal of Political Science, Volume 31, Issue 1, they look at the impact of Perot's entry on voter turnout. They concluded that Perot increased voter turnout by 3%, but also concluded that Perot's entry into the presidential race decreased Clinton's margin over Bush by 7%, thus indicating Perot's entry negatively impacting Clinton's votes, not Bush. Niskanen in 1996 found that Perot's entry into the race actually increased Bush major party votes by a whopping 6.4%, since he mostly took from Clinton. This research was done for the Cato Institute, a right-leaning libertarian think tank. And if we look at the data from the time, Pew Research's October panel back survey, which examined voters after Perot's re-entry, or really still first entry into the election, found that Perot was taken away 6% of Clinton's support, while taking only 4% away from Bush. Research by Gordon Black and Benjamin Black for the Roper Institute actually found that if Perot were a competitive candidate challenging for the presidency, that it was Bush that was considered the third choice and thus a wasted vote. According to the research, which used the VRS data we mentioned earlier, quote, President Bush would have been the third choice, and his voters would have confronted the problem of wasting their vote for Bush, or either turning to Clinton or Perot. Since Perot is closer to Bush than to Clinton on many issues, he might have picked up a majority of those switching to their second choice, end quote. So yes, while Bush voters might have gone to Perot, which could have won Perot the presidency, Perot voters would have still been evenly split. Finally, let's delve into the American National Election Studies data. This has been the gold standard in voting behavior data in American politics since 1948 and was the backbone of the book The American Voter by Campbell, Converse, Miller, and Stokes, which is the genesis of modern voting behavior. If you would like me to do a video about voting behavior literature as well as the myths, please let me know down below, as this is actually my wheelhouse. Anyway, back to the 1992 ANES time series. The study asked voters if they had considered other candidates before they made their final choice. Of those who eventually voted for Perot, the data shows that 36.9% of Perot voters considered voting only for Bush, with 35.9% only considering Clinton and 6.6% considering both. This data supports what we have previously talked about, that Perot voters were split. In addition, the ANES has feeling thermometers, asking voters on a scale of 0 to 100, with 100 being the most positive, how they feel about political figures. Of Perot voters' post-election feeling thermometers, Bush's rating was at 53.9%, while Clinton was at 55.7%, with 54% of these feeling thermometers being higher for Clinton and 46% being higher for Bush. So, in the end, the research, both academic and non-academic, as well as the data sets from the election, are undeniably on the side that Perot voters were split between Clinton and Bush and didn't affect the outcome of the election. Therefore, we can consider this myth busted. And if you are someone who believes the myth and this information didn't convince you, then you might want to stop watching this video now and, as Sean Munger would say, go and watch some cat videos, because nothing will convince you otherwise. With that, let's go on to the next myth. The next myth I want to jump into is about the famous first Kennedy-Nixon debate, and that people who listened to the debate on the radio thought that Nixon had won the debate, while those who watched it on television believed that Kennedy won the debate. Unlike the Perot voters that I talked about, where there is a lot of information available because there is a lot of data and academic literature, in the case of the myth regarding Nixon winning the debate with radio listeners, the data just doesn't seem to be there. So, where does this myth come from? Well, let's turn to the Nixon Foundation. If anyone were to keep the myth of Nixon winning the debate alive, it would definitely be the Nixon Foundation at the Nixon Presidential Library. On the 50th anniversary of the debate, the Nixon Foundation wrote the following, quote, "In Slate, David Greenberg writes about the familiar claim that JFK won the debate amongst those who saw the debate on TV, while Richard Nixon won amongst those who only heard it on radio." Greenberg notes that only one survey actually broke radio listeners out as a separate group. Albert E. Sindlinger's market research firm found Nixon winning amongst radio listeners 43% to 20%, and Kennedy winning amongst TV watchers 28% to 19%. From this poll, some have concluded that JFK won on appearance, not substance. By itself, as Greenberg correctly says, this poll does not provide strong evidence for that conclusion. The radio subsample was small, and in any event, radio listeners might well have been predispositioned to back Richard Nixon in the first place. End quote. So yes, the first source is the Sindlinger poll, but there are also two other rather bad sources that indicate at the time that Nixon won amongst radio listeners. The second source was an article by Atlanta Constitution Journal writer Ralph McGill, who had a non-scientific group of people listening to the debate. McGill said, quote, "By arrangement, this reporter had a number of persons listen to the great debate on radio. It's interesting to report they unanimously thought Mr. Nixon had the better of it." The third and last contemporaneous resource that researchers can find is from Earl Mazzo in a book called The Great Debates, published in 1962, in which he asked attendees to the Southern Governors Conference. Not exactly the most random of samples, considering many Southern governors were hostile toward John Kennedy based on the issue of integration. But back to the poll. Out of the 2,100 people who were surveyed, only 282 people listened to it on the radio, with only 178 expressing an opinion of who won or lost. Berkshire and Devine in 2017 expand on this. They argue that in the poll, those who listened to the debate by radio were more likely to live in rural Republican areas, thus skewing the poll to be more favorable toward Nixon. Still, those who supported the myth argue that because Nixon won according to those who listened to the debate on the radio, that he had more substance to what he said, and that Kennedy simply won because of his looks. Berkshire and Devine looked at both ANES data and other polling data, such as Gallup, to see how the polls impacted the race. Their conclusion was that the debate didn't matter, and basically everything that has been reported about the debate is overblown. Regarded Nixon having substance because he was perceived to have won on radio, their study found that most who watched the debates, regardless of the medium, thought that Kennedy had more substance than Nixon. But also, the authors point out that they didn't find that Kennedy was the winner of the debate because he looked good on camera. In their research, they, as well as many of the researchers that they quote in their article's literature review, find that Kennedy's appearance myth was something mostly created after Kennedy's death, saying, quote, "We tend to remember the adored Kennedy mourned by the nation in the wake of his loss, plastered with images of a young, attractive man cut down too early in life," end quote. So no, there is no evidence that Nixon won the debate with radio listeners, with the data being extremely weak. However, we can say the same for Kennedy when it came to television viewers because of his looks. Most literature said that the first debate really didn't change the outcome, and that Nixon closing the gap on Kennedy happened in the dying days of the campaign, not around September 26th, which was when the first debate was held. However, the literature does say that it is possible that later debates helped Nixon. With that, we can actually debunk two myths at the same time. But let's stay with the same election and move to our next political myth, which is that dead people voted in Chicago and that Daley stole the election for Kennedy. So, remember Earl Mazzo, the one that had the dubious claim that Nixon won the debate on radio because he talked to a few people at a Southern Governors Conference? Yes, he seems to also be the source that dead people in Chicago voted for Kennedy. In the Presidential Studies Quarterly, Volume 15, Issue 1, Edmund Kalina argues, quote, "The man most responsible for perpetuating this belief was veteran political reporter Earl Mazzo. In December 1960, Mazzo had written a series of articles which suggested very strongly that Kennedy had been cheating. This series had appeared in the New York Herald Tribune, the Washington Post, the Chicago Sun-Times, and other newspapers throughout the United States. Mazzo detailed irregularities in the conduct of the election in Chicago, Texas, and elsewhere. Although Mazzo was unable to alter the outcome of the election, he was able, partly because of his close association with Nixon, to influence the perception of the election." End quote. Kalina therefore decided to investigate this matter, which resulted in the article in which I'm quoting from. Even though a recount of all of Cook County was expensive, one Republican candidate running for Cook County State's Attorney, Ben Adamowski, was allowed to request a recount. And even though he requested a recount for his race, observers were looking at the ballots to see if there had been any irregularities in the presidential race, though that race itself wasn't being recounted. Democrats were trying to hurry up the process, which led to even more suspicion, leading to Judge Thaddeus V. Adesco to change the recount process, directing 25 teams of counters to meticulously look at each ballot, including the presidential election in the recount. Now, one thing has to be said, and that is that the counting of votes in Chicago in 1960 was bad, with Kalina calling it, quote, "unbelievably sloppy and inaccurate," end quote. In fact, all of the literature that I have come across essentially agree that the counting in Chicago was really bad. In fact, Kalina states that mistakes of 10 or more votes happened in 16.9% of Chicago precincts in the presidential race, which was an astronomically high number. With this alone, many argued that there was fraud in the counting of votes, which, according to Kalina, always resulted in benefits for the Democratic candidates. So yes, there were massive issues regarding vote counting in Chicago. However, did that result in Nixon actually receiving enough votes to win Illinois? Kalina's answer is no. After an examination of both the paper and machine ballot recounts ordered by the courts in 1961 by Adamowski, it said that Nixon wouldn't have won enough votes to win Illinois' electoral votes. Still, the literature does argue that there were Democratic shenanigans going on. So would it be fair to say that Daley and the Democratic machine tried to do what they could by not counting Republican votes? While not 100% provable, it is highly likely that that's the case. In the end, would it have mattered? No, not really. Other academic resources listed below basically come to that same conclusion. As far as the dead people voting, that is purely a myth with no academic research showing the allegation actually being true. Now, one that I was going to put on this list was the Cronkite moment, which refers to CBS News anchor Walter Cronkite's report on Vietnam, describing it as a stalemate. It is said that when President Lyndon Johnson saw that, he said something to the effect of, "If I lost Cronkite, I've lost Middle America," and decided not to run for president. This is another political myth, but I have already done a full video solely on that myth, so you can check it out in that video. I'll make sure to have the link to it at the end of this video. The next probable myth that I want to talk about is that Robert F. Kennedy would have been elected as president in 1968 had he not been assassinated. Now, when it comes to academic publications, many political scientists don't like to be in the what if business. Most try to further explain the known than guess the unknown. This is why I say probable myth, because we really don't know what would have happened. Unlike with Ross Perot, who actually did run, actually did receive votes, with data of those voters showing their intentions. This RFK question is actually a topic that I am researching for a book that I hope will come out next year. Some of what I will talk about in this comes from that initial research for that book, with the sources eventually being presented then, since there are way too many sources to list here. For those who say that Robert Kennedy would have beaten Richard Nixon, they fundamentally don't even ask the first question, which is if Kennedy would have even won the Democratic nomination in the first place. While we talk about victory in the California primary, which was before the McGovern-Fraser Commission, which changed the Democratic rules, which would eventually give us the primary system that we know today, delegates at a convention were still mostly determined by party bosses, not primary results. During his time as Attorney General, Robert Kennedy made a lot of enemies in the Democratic Party. Many of those enemies were elected Democrats that Bobby tried to clamp down on. For example, in the state of Nevada, the Democratic Party was highly involved with the gambling industry, and Bobby Kennedy was trying to break up organized crime within the gambling industry. Yes, much of the Democratic Party in Nevada at that time had connections with the mob, with the exception of one political science professor from the University of Nevada, Reno. The delegation was uncommitted to a candidate, allowing them to pick whoever they wanted to on the first ballot. But it wasn't just Kennedy's enemies, but some of his friends as well that were not willing to jump onto the Kennedy train. One of those was Kansas Governor Robert Docking, a close political friend to all of the Kennedys. It was expected by local media that Docking's connection to the Kennedy family would have led to an immediate endorsement. But it didn't, as Docking was still a calculated politician and not just a Kennedy ally. And he essentially controlled all of Kansas's convention delegates. And even before his assassination, Humphrey was moving ahead on delegates in non-primary states. Once Robert Kennedy was assassinated, Docking supported Humphrey. With that, it's a very gray area to definitely say that Kennedy would have even won the nomination. But for argument's sake, let's say that Kennedy won the nomination. Could he have beaten Nixon in the general election? All polls leading up to that fateful night in California indicate that Kennedy was running behind both Nixon and Rockefeller. The only time that Kennedy had topped both men was in the April 1st Harris poll, which saw Kennedy leading Nixon 44% to 39% and Rockefeller 43% to 34%. The Gallup poll also had Kennedy leading the Democratic field for the nomination. But in the last polls before his assassination, Kennedy was equal to or worse than the other Democrats against the Republicans. In the last Gallup poll, Kennedy was losing to Nixon by 10% and Rockefeller by 14%. In comparison, Humphrey was only losing to Nixon by 3% and Rockefeller by 7%, with McCarthy down only 2% to Nixon and 9% to Rockefeller. In each poll, Kennedy had the lower total support of any candidate. Therefore, the polling data shows a slide for Kennedy. But of course, these were polls in May. Anything could have happened over the course of an election, and Kennedy could have won. But to make a definitive claim that Kennedy would have absolutely been president is not backed up by any real evidence, with the hypotheticals actually pointing to the opposite. Oh, and another myth in that election is that Kennedy supporters jumped over to Eugene McCarthy once Kennedy was assassinated. But that mostly isn't true. While some did, especially those who were strongly anti-Vietnam War, most Kennedy supporters drafted George McGovern to be the Kennedy standard bearer. If you want to know more about that, you can read The Making of the President by Theodore White. But I would highly recommend watching the 1968 convention coverage that is already readily available here on YouTube. Now, the last few Kennedy examples I used are important, as it shows that many people make claims without any evidence. And in those cases, we can really only say that claim might be true or might be false. We can't make any definitive claims without evidence to back it up. But one claim that supporters of Hillary Clinton in 2016 say, which is an absolute myth, is that Bernie Sanders supporters and voters voted for Donald Trump. Interestingly, this isn't as research as much as you think it would be, and much of the research out there looks more at the insurgent candidacies of both Trump and Sanders instead of Sanders voters in the general election. But there is still some research out there nonetheless, as well as the ANES studies that I mentioned earlier. One main study that I can find is from Brian F. Schaffner, who uses the Cooperative Congressional Election Study, which is similar to the ANES, to determine that roughly 12% of Bernie Sanders' primary voters voted for Trump. That might seem like a large or a small number depending on what your perception of large is. But in another post-2016 election study by Sides, Tesler, and Vavrick in 2018, quote, among Democratic primary voters who were interviewed about their primary preference in July 2016 and interviewed again after the general election, nearly 8 in 10, or 79%, of Sanders supporters reported voting for Clinton. This level of partisan loyalty was actually higher than 2008, which featured a long and hard-fought Democratic primary. In that election, about 70% of Clinton primary voters reported voting for Barack Obama. Indeed, even the Sanders supporters that Clinton did not win over, notably the estimated 12% of Sanders supporters who supported Trump in the general election, were probably not going to support her no matter what. When the Sanders-Trump voters had been interviewed 4 years prior, after the 2012 election, only 35% reported voting for Obama. Most of these voters were not really Democratic to begin with. End quote. In addition to the research from Sides, Tesler, and Vavrick, the RAND Corporation also conducted their own research showing that the Sanders to Trump voter percentage might have been as low as 6%. The ANES study for 2016 confirms the other studies, with stating that 77.3% of Sanders supporters voted for Clinton, but only 11.1% voting for Trump. Most of the others voted for minor party candidates. So, of the research that has been provided so far, and provided by some highly respected political scientists like John Sides and Lynn Vavrick, we can easily say that the data and research to date shows that Sanders supporters not only overwhelmingly voted for Clinton, but that they supported Clinton more than Clinton's own supporters supported Barack Obama in 2008. The next set of myths are in a previous video, which is the 1988 presidential election between Michael Dukakis and George Bush. Many argue that it was either the tank photo, the Willie Horton ad, the revolving door ad, the rumor by Idaho Senator Steve Sims that Kitty Dukakis burned the American flag, or the question that Bernard Shaw asked Michael Dukakis about the death penalty that eventually sunk Dukakis. But those academics who have already written about this say that even though these tactics really attack the character of Michael Dukakis, he was probably going to lose anyway, even with an 18% lead in the polls. First, let's talk about the 18% boost for Dukakis after the Democratic National Convention. According to Gelman and King in 1992, this was just purely a convention bump. Both argue that polling itself was quite variable and are easily influenced by events, as well as the media's coverage of the events, especially early in the cycle. In fact, as I mentioned in my original video, while Dukakis had a large lead after the convention, it almost started to sink just as quickly with Bush taking the lead in the polls not long afterwards. Overall, it seems like this was just an impressive convention bump and nothing more from the positive media coverage of the convention. Other scholars seem to generally agree with this position of Dukakis's lead being nothing more than a convention boost. But what about the impact of the attacks against Dukakis? Well, research around the impact of this varies, but basically comes to the same conclusion. For example, in Lynn Vavrick's The Message Matters, she argued that Michael Dukakis was an insurgent candidate and did not shift his campaign strategy toward where the voters were. Dukakis's message was unfocused and argued that government could work for the people. The attacks against Dukakis, especially when it came to crime, argued that Dukakis's policies in Massachusetts were not working for the people. And while Vavrick does believe that there were racial elements to some of the attacks, where this actually hurt Dukakis was on his crime policy overall. It wasn't simply an argument of racism won Bush the election. And when it comes to the tank, all of the research I found said that the tank incident had little to no impact on the polls, as Dukakis had already been dropping by that time. In addition to Vavrick's research, Shanks and Miller in 1991 argue that Reagan's popularity played an impact when it came to Bush's victory. Simply put, Reagan was still popular and voters voted for his vice president. But on top of that, they also argue that between 1984 and 1988, more people started identifying with conservatives and Republicans instead of liberals and Democrats, which led to the electorate leaning conservative. Abramowitz and Siegel in 1990 also make a few other arguments. First, there were a lot of issues that differentiated the candidates beyond Willie Horton, the tank, and Kitty Dukakis. Therefore, when it came to policy, there were two very clear choices. Another point they made, and this kind of points back to what Vavrick was talking about, was that Dukakis was the insurgent, time for a change candidate when people didn't really want change. Most Americans were satisfied with the state of things in the United States, from their economic situation to foreign policy. Overall, they didn't see a reason to change horses mid-race. People were happy, they didn't want to change. Reagan was popular, and Dukakis wasn't offering them anything. If he did, the Bush campaign was able to attack his record as governor. The results would have probably been the same whether Horton, the tank, the flag burning rumor, or Bernard Shaw's question never existed. In this video, I wanted to dispel or at least challenge beliefs that many people have about certain elections and to bring forward empirical evidence that has either been peer-reviewed or published academically. I wanted this video to go beyond just the hearsay and actually give clear, consensus-based views of what happened. And with that, we are finished with today's video. Remember, if you want to watch my Cronkite moment video, that's the video on the left. If there are any other myths that you want me to look at, or something that you might think is a myth, put it in the comments below and I can start researching them for a part 2 video. Again, if you want to help the channel, please subscribe and consider joining my Patreon. Have a wonderful day wherever it is you are, and I will see you in the next video. Bye for now.